Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Well, my name is Kate Gleason. I'm the membership director here at the Garden, and I know the tradition. Any brand new members joining us today, or is this anybody's first speaker series? A couple? Okay, good. Well, thanks for being here. This is a monthly program. We will take December off, but we do this 11 times a year. And this is the time of year I put out the call. If you have any ideas for either speakers or topics you're interested in, do let us know. We're busy planning for 2025, but we'd love to hear from you and get you on the list if you have a great idea. So please, you can either just talk to me or you can email the email address on the back of your membership card is a great way. Just say "Attention Kate" and they'll get it to me. Anyway, before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to do a plug for the next program. If you haven't signed up, it is probably our most popular one of the year. It's our annual Holiday Decorating Speaker Series. We'll offer it 2 times on November 12th, which is a Tuesday, and it'll be at 10 a.m. and at 2 p.m. I've heard that the 10 a.m. is sold out, so if you haven't gotten a spot, grab a spot for the 2 p.m. We'll be welcoming Michael Schrader, who is a longtime friend of the Garden, but more importantly, he's the floral director at Schnucks Markets. And if anybody is from the Webster-Kirkwood area, may know his home, which is located right off Adams, and he does a spectacular holiday display outside and equally inside. So he's very talented and is the right person to do our annual holiday decorating program to get us all in the mood. So again, that is November 12th. November 12th is also right there at the beginning of Member Appreciation Days. So November 11th through 17th, it's our annual week where we supersize your member benefits and just say thank you for all your support. That week we offer an extra 10% off in the gift shop. So you'll get a 20% discount if you don't already in the gift shop. 10% off at Sassafras, which usually you do not get a discount on dining, but you'll get 10% off that week. And then that's also, I think everybody knows, the membership sale. So memberships will be 20% off that week only. You can absolutely use that to renew. You can renew early if you're not due for a while, but you can also consider giving the gift of membership. It's perfect timing to buy a holiday gift. So if there's somebody who you think would love membership as much as you do, I encourage you to consider gift membership and help us spread the word. So again, that's November 11th through 17th is Member Appreciation Days. Member Appreciation Days culminates on the 15th of Friday evening with our member preview for Garden Glow. So we'll kick off Garden Glow for the holiday season this year. If you've wandered the garden before the program, you may see our crew is very busy putting up Garden Glow, transforming this from the fall landscape to the winter one. Some great new elements this year, over 2 million lights. And as a member, you do save $5 on tickets. If you're at that festival level or higher, you do get 6 free tickets for the season. So keep that in mind. But again, that'll kick off November 15th. It will go through January 4th. We'll take a couple nights off, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Christmas Eve, but otherwise we'll be here every night. I do recommend, if you're new to membership, you may not realize, but get your tickets in advance, especially if you plan to go to Garden Glow on a weekend, or if you want to come early in the evening. Garden Glow kicks off at either 4:30 or 5 o'clock every evening, depending on the date you choose. And those early time slots are what fill up. So if you are interested in an early time slot, I would reserve your tickets in advance. You don't have to do it, months in advance, but at least a few days or a week or so in advance, and you should be good to go. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Gibson, who is an Emeritus Professor of Plant Biology in the School of Biological Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. For over 30 years, David taught courses in botany and ecology, including forensic botany, which is the focus of our presentation today. David conducts ecological research and has published more than 180 research papers and 4 books, including Planting Clues, How Plants Solve Crimes, which will be for sale. I know a few of you grabbed that coming in. We'll also have it available on the way out while supplies last, here right outside the room. Originally from Great Britain, David is a passionate fan of the Premier League football club Brighton and Hove Albion. He lives in Carbondale, Illinois with his wife, Lisa. Their 2 children have flown the coop and live in St. Louis and Chicago. On this week of Halloween, let's give a warm welcome to David.
Okay, thank you, Kate, for the introduction. I didn't know you were going to read all that stuff about me being a football fan and things like that. But anyway, yeah. So I'm very happy to be here, to have the opportunity to give this talk to you today. I've sat where you are and listened to talks in this series, so I've been excited to hear the talks, and so I hope you'll enjoy my talk. To start us off, one thing is I like to do when I give talks is to break the ice a little bit by take a picture of my audience. And as you can see from this one, sometimes you don't know what you're going to get. The lady on the front there is already scrolling on her phone at the beginning. So as a former university lecturer, I'm kind of used to that. And so if I see you doing that, I'll call you out. But if you don't mind, if you've got a copy of my book, hold it up. It'd be a great picture. Okay. One more. There you go. Brilliant. It'll be all over social media later on today. So that was a group of people in Carbondale that I talked to a little while ago. So as Kate said, the focus of my talk is on forensic botany, and particularly the book that I published a couple of years ago that some of you have kindly already purchased, called Planting Clues: How Plants Solve Crimes. I'm really happy that it came out. I enjoyed writing it, working on it, and so forth. But it's also been translated, not by me, into Polish and Italian. The Italian one's on the top and the Polish one's on the bottom. Which I assume they're good translations because I don't speak either of the languages, but they look very nice. But if you happen to speak or know someone that speaks either of those two languages, I do have a couple of copies of that book with me today that I can sell to you. Or if you just want to add to the collection that you have, right? You have all editions. Anyway, so the book is all, my talk is organized by going through the different chapters in the book. And the titles are listed here, the 7 chapters. And of course, when you write a book like this, the publisher encourages you to have titles that don't necessarily tell you much about what's in the chapter. So I'll help you there. So the first chapter is about the famous Lindbergh kidnapping, which was the first time that botanical evidence was accepted into a court of law in the United States. And so it continues to be a very famous case. Second chapter is a bit about forensics and forensic science and how botanical evidence and other sorts of evidence can be used in legal cases. And then I go through the three sort of main sorts of plant evidence that can be used in criminal cases: pieces of plants, plant fragments, parts you could see or with a hand lens, bits of plants that are too small to really see carefully or clearly, seeds, spores, pollen and diatoms, and how they can be used or are used. And then DNA, plant DNA is used just like human DNA is used in forensic cases. And then a couple of other topics where plants sort of get involved in legal issues, namely poisons, when someone is accidentally or deliberately poisoned. And if it's a plant, you need to know what it is. And if it's on purpose, you need to kind of figure it out. And then poaching, which is a huge problem of trafficking of plants, stealing them out of the wild from around the world, rare plants and things like that. And in those cases, you have to be able to work out what the plant is and see if it's a restricted plant or not. So Kate mentioned a bit about this, but a little bit more background of how I get to be given this talk and writing that book. I want to say I'm not a criminologist. I'm not a lawyer. I don't work in crime labs. I'm a retired university professor, a botanist. And this became an interest of mine. So my background is in botany, and my undergraduate, master's and PhD are all in botany from the universities that you see listed there. And I did postdoctoral research in plant ecology at Rutgers University and Kansas State University, and then ended up 30 or so years ago, I think more like 32 years ago now, in Southern Illinois at SIU. At some point, the department chair called me into his office, as they do now and again, and to kind of talk to you about how things are going and that sort of thing. And he said to me, he said, David, you need to do a little bit more teaching. Some of the other faculty don't think you teach enough. I think, okay, here comes 600 students, introductory biology, 5 times a week or something like that. He said, no, well, you can tell me what you want to do, develop a course, and if I like it, we'll let you teach it and see how it goes. And so I had recently been in the library, which we used to go to libraries to get books and things. And I'd been browsing the shelves looking for something else. And I came across a couple of books that talk about forensic botany, very sort of dry academic tomes. I thought, well, that's interesting, because like many of you, I had an interest in crime shows on TV and things like that. And so I checked these out and looked at them. But when I was given this opportunity to develop a course, I thought, this is a great sort of course to develop because it's a sneaky way of teaching botany to people that aren't necessarily interested in it. And so I developed this course for upper level undergraduates, and I would get students out of chemistry and criminal justice come in with no botanical background whatsoever, and they'd learn some botany. And I thought, this is great, And we actually happened to have a forensic minor at Southern Illinois University. And so students that are enrolled in that minor could take my class as well. So the goal of the course was to learn some botany and to think about how botanical evidence is used in criminal cases. But along the way, we thought about how real are some of these kind of Hollywood cases that you see on some of the crime shows like CSI and things like that, where they kind of exaggerate things a little bit. So that was kind of the goal of the course. So as a bit more background before I get into the different chapters, some ways in which botanical evidence can be important in legal investigations. And the first part, I can talk about crimes against people. When someone gets murdered, you're looking for clues to figure out a suspect and so forth. But there's all these other ways in which plants are important in legal cases, because there are plants where it's illegal to grow them, to transport them, and so forth, legal plants, drug plants, exotic plants and noxious weeds that can be illegal to sell and so forth. Rare plant poaching that I'll talk about towards the end. Biofuel escapes. Someone has to identify what they're looking at if something's escaped. The planting of prohibited genetically modified crops. When the big seed companies sell soybean seed that's been genetically modified to a farmer and they grow it in the field, the farmer is not allowed to keep the seed and grow them again next year. They have to pay again, buy it again. But some of them do, and then they get caught. How do they get caught? You've got to figure out that they're using seed from that crop that they bought to start off with. And plant poisons, as I mentioned before. If someone dies from a poison, it might be a plant-derived poison, and you've got to work out what it is. So all these different ways, by the way, on the side there, there's ginseng, which is a medicinal plant, which is collected. And sometimes it's collected out of nature preserves and areas where you're not supposed to go in and collect these plants. But it becomes difficult to identify because the part of the plant that's of interest is the rhizome at the bottom, the root structures. And so when you just have that, it's harder to identify. So it becomes harder. You need more expertise to figure out if you have something that's prohibited or not. So that's where a botanist will come in to play, what will be useful. And crime labs don't, as a rule, employ botanists, and they outsource this sort of requirement to specialists, either like the Botanical Garden here. I'll talk about a couple of cases where botanists from the garden have worked on some cases, and or to universities and so forth. And so in these cases, the botanists involved have to have certain levels of expertise for the particular sort of plant material they're looking at. And so I list some of these down here. So systematics, identifying plants, anatomy and morphology, what plants look like externally and internally, palynology, study of pollen, ecology, where plants grow, that can be very important. Chemistry, if you're trying to identify a poison, you may only have a powder to look at. And genetics, the DNA evidence. And in all these cases, when an expert or a botanist does do some sort of identification, they have to then present it into court. And so they then go into court as what's called an expert witness. And there are a lot of rules involved about expert witnesses. And of course, when they go into court, the opposing counsel is going to check that they really are experts, ask them lots of difficult questions about their background and expertise and so forth. And so it's quite a daunting challenge, but they have to be an expert in what they're talking about. So I'll sort of finish up the introduction with a couple of famous cases, or a few famous cases. You may recognize some of these cases. I'll be talking in more detail about the Ted Bundy case, the Baby Lindbergh case, and the Maricopa case in a minute. But to start off us off, the Casey and Kaylee Anthony case, which you may remember, when a young girl was abducted from her home and lost, and her body was eventually found. And of course, the prime suspect in most of these cases is a close relative, in this case, her mother, who was eventually not found guilty in this case. But as part of the case, when they found the body, they found it out in the woods, they wanted to know how long the body had been there, lying out in the woods. And so they brought in a botanist, a woman called Jane Bock from the University of Colorado, and said to her, if you look at the leaves underneath the body, does that give you an idea of how long the body's been lying out there in the wood? And she said, yeah, I think 2 months, because looking at the compression of the leaves and the decomposition compared with areas where there wasn't a body, she thought 2 months. That was part of and she was actually for the defense. The prosecution brought in another forensic botanist who gave a completely different time frame based upon his expertise. And this is an example of how difficult it can be. In this case, we had 2 different botanists given different sorts of evidence because it's difficult to know. But that's how this sort of evidence became important. In this case, a lot of evidence was presented, of course. This is just one part of it. So you can see a couple of the pictures there that show the leaves. They removed the body here, and you can see the ground where the body, underneath where the body was. So, first chapter is called Tree Never Lies, and this is the chapter that I talk about the first case in which botanical evidence was brought into US court and accepted into court. This is back in the 1930s, and it involved the kidnapping of a young toddler child called Charles Lindbergh, who was the son of Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator. He was the man that flew across the Atlantic in the Spirit of St. Louis, the aircraft that you see there. And this is back in March 1st, 1932. And this, because the father was a celebrity because of what he'd done, this became like the O.J. Simpson case of the time, and huge publicity and so forth. And people still talk about this. Earlier this year, I was sitting at home watching television and CNN, and Abby Phillip came on and said, this day in history, and she flashed up that poster. Oh my God, I quickly snapped a picture of it. I thought, I've got to show that to people. We're still talking about this case today. It was that important. It's called the crime of the century at the time. We had lots of these crimes of the century, but that was the one they talked about. So what happened? Sorry about this fuzzy picture, because I've enlarged something small. But basically what happened was that in the evening of the March 1st, 1932, the Lindbergh family were having supper in the bottom left-hand corner in their dining room. And the baby was up in the nursery in the top right-hand corner, and was supposedly being watched by the nanny, a woman called Betty Gow. And she comes running down about 10 o'clock and says, the baby's gone, the baby's gone. And so all panic ensues. And so they go up and the baby's gone from the nursery. One of the windows was unlatched. So there's a bit of a clue there. And so they start looking, and they find on the ground a wooden ladder. And you can see this picture there shows the ladder. They put it back up against the window so you can see it. And the kidnapper had made a ladder himself and leant it against the wall then, climbed in the window and kidnapped the baby. So the kidnapper also left a ransom note, and so they had, and through some intermediaries, he started exchanging notes between the kidnapper and the police, and he was asking for money, and they gave him some money, ransom money, which he started to spend. So they caught him because he started spending these marked notes. So he was the suspect they had was a fellow called Bruno Hauptmann, who was a 34-year-old carpenter. So they brought in a forester, someone who works for the US Forest Service, Arthur Kohler, as an expert witness to look at this ladder. And so he looked at it. It's a homemade ladder. He didn't get it from Lowe's or somewhere like that, you know. And what he found was that it was made from various sorts of wood: yellow pine, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and birch. And when he looked at the rungs and the rails, he found that the saw marks on them matched saw marks from the wood mill where the suspect worked. And he had to visit about 100 or so sawmills in the Northeast to find ones that had matched up. But he also found that apparently when making the ladder, it ran out of wood. And so he cut some wood out of his attic, of his home. And you can see the picture on the right there where one of the parts have been put back into his attic, and it matched even more closely. I assume he never thought that they would look at this level of detail of the ladder. So everything matched up. They could tell where the wood came from, some from work and some from his home. So that tied the suspect to the ladder on the crime scene. So here's his plane and some of the bits of rails next to each other. And you see the marks along this in the days when it was all hand planing and everything. And so each instrument gave particular marks on the wood. So they took him into court. They introduced, the judge allowed botanical evidence in for the first time in the United States. Defense objected, of course, but the judge allowed it. And he was found guilty and put to death in the electric chair. The baby, by the way, didn't survive. The baby was dropped as he was coming down the ladder. He took the baby with him and dumped him in the woods, and they found the baby a little while later as part of the investigation. So it's a very sad story, very interesting story. It's led to what's called the Lindbergh kidnapping law, which makes it a federal offense to kidnap and take someone across a state line, and so forth. If you're interested in more of this, the nanny, Betty Gao, of course, was one of the first suspects, and she was never prosecuted or anything. And just recently, Mariah Fredericks wrote a book, a fictionalized account of the nanny based on what we know and the diaries of the wife of Charles Lindbergh, who kept these very detailed diaries about her life, including this episode. So this is a fascinating fictionalized account of the whole thing. It's a really nice read if you want to know about it. All right, so that's the first time botanical evidence was brought into a court. So how is it used kind of in the court sense? Forensic evidence generally follows what's called Locard's exchange principle. And Edmond Locard was the founder of forensic science, and he established the first police laboratory of forensic science in Lyon in France in 1910. And there he is, in front of a microscope. And he was not only a very hard-working forensic scientist doing all sorts of forensic evidence, but he was a prolific writer, and he wrote a lot of books about forensics. And in it, he included these phrases that I've pulled up here, which of course were in French, but they're translated here. The truth is that none can act with the intensity induced by criminal activities without leaving multiple traces of his path. In other words, every time a crime is committed, the criminal is going to either bring in some traces or carry some traces with them as they leave the crime scene. And if you can figure out what those things are, there's your forensic evidence. And what he went on to say in 1920 was, sometimes the perpetrator leaves traces at a scene by their actions. Sometimes, alternatively, she picked up on their clothes or their body traces of their location or presence. So they're bringing stuff in. So this led to the establishment of what's called the the exchange principle is shown in the diagram on the bottom there, where you've got physical evidence connecting a victim to a crime scene to a suspect. So if you can get some sort of evidence to connect those things up, then you can prosecute the case. And Lockhart, in his cases, included botanical evidence in many of the cases that he was looking at as well. If you're interested in his life, there's a book just came out this year, Edmond Lockhart, Le Fondateur de la Police Scientifique. It's in French, so you have to be able to speak French. There's no English language version of this book, but it just came out. It's interesting looking book. I'm trying to struggle through it. All right, so let's talk more about some of the different sorts of evidence. So plant fragments, the parts, the sorts of evidence that perhaps you can see or look at with a hand lens or might need a microscope. So this sort of evidence, like other botanical evidence, can be used to undermine an alibi. An alibi is when a suspect says, I wasn't there, wasn't me, I was someone else. But again, if you can connect them to the crime scene or the victim, then you maybe have got them. So you want to link them. A couple of famous cases that you may have heard about. Ted Bundy, the serial killer who killed lots of young ladies in Montana and Florida. And they knew he was doing it, but they couldn't get him. One of the parts of evidence that they finally had that helped prosecute him and find him guilty was that in the van that he stole when he kidnapped his last victim in Florida, they found plant fragments caught up underneath the vehicle in the undercarriage that they traced back to where he'd kidnapped the victim. So that was good to get that. Jamie Saffron, who was a particularly nasty serial killer, and his thing was to dismember his victims and then take body parts out and bury them in different places. What he didn't know was when he was doing that, bits of plants from his yard were getting onto those body parts. And they found these body parts and found plant fragments on them, and they worked out what they were. Two of them were Chinese privet and umbrella tree. Not necessarily uncommon plants, but they matched what was on the body parts and matched what he was growing in his own garden. So a combination of plant parts. So he would have, and Ted Bundy too, these people have no idea that they're transporting evidence at the time they're committing these crimes. And sometimes you just have to look. Other ways that large plant parts can be important is in the timing of events. Your plants have a phenology. They grow at different times of the year. Annuals grow in the spring or for 1 year. When a plant gets damaged or droughted, it may wilt. Or if a stem gets broken, sap oozes out of it. When it gets this time of year, the chlorophyll degrades, we get the fall colors. There's a case where a bone was found, the time of which, how long a body had been there, the skeletonized remains had been at a site, was based upon the degradation of the leaves underneath a single bone of a body. A couple of other examples here. I think the top one is actually a staged photograph, but if you see a tree growing through a skull like that, well, you want to know how long that skull's been there. That's a really important thing. It's called a post-mortem interval. It helps you understand how long it's been since death. Well, you can cut that tree and count the rings. It gives you a minimum estimate. The moss is growing on the skull. A real case of this where they found mosses growing on a skull, and there happened to be a couple of species of mosses that grew with a particular pattern where every year they produced some branches. And so they could count the number of branching units, and they knew how long the mosses had been growing on the skull. Helps them understand how long that skull had been there. Now, it takes a bit of time for the body to decompose, to leave the skull, but it gives you some timing. And this can be critically important in these sorts of things. So here's a real example, a somewhat local example. It's the case of People versus Charles Michael Ashley. It was tried in Crawford County in Illinois, which is southeast of here. And the defendant was a man called Charles Michael Ashley, and he was charged with multiple counts of murder and arson on February the 1st, 1987 in Robinson, Illinois, which is southeast of here. And what happened was that he went to the house of a woman called Melinda Buchanan, who was a 24-year-old mother, and on a pretext, he'd met her earlier on in a different setting, and he found out where she lived, and he went to her house, and she let him in. Didn't really know him, but she sort of knew him. Anyway, he proceeded to rape and murder her, and as he left, he set fire to the house, killing her two daughters, Jennifer and Rachel. So when they investigated this case, they found some plant fragments on his clothes and under her fingernails and other areas. And so they gave these plant fragments to one of my colleagues at Southern Illinois, Dr. Barbara Crandall-Stotler, who's a bryologist. She studies mosses and liverworts. And so she investigated these fragments and worked out what they were. So, and went into court. So here are some of her slides that she gave me, or lent me. And they show plant fragments under the victim's fingernails, on the victim's clothing, on a coat that the defendant left in the bedroom, big mistake, and on a bandana that he left in his truck. Now, if you look at these, can you tell the different sorts of plants apart here? They look the same, don't they? They are the same. They're all the same plant. Anybody know what they might be? So it's from a pot plant. It's peat moss, sphagnum. They're all sphagnum. Now, there are various species of sphagnum, and Dr. Crandall-Stotler is an expert in these, and she was able to very quickly identify these as sphagnum because the anatomy of the leaf cells is very, very distinctive. And she said they're all the same species, and it all came from a potted plant that had been in the bedroom, that had been knocked over during the melee. And they got on to the victim and the suspect. So this evidence of the peat moss tied the suspect to the crime scene and to the victim. Really good evidence. And he's found guilty and is still in prison. So it's peat moss, you're familiar with it. And he's got these nice little leaves on it. Another way in which plant fragments can be important are in stomach and intestinal contents. We eat a lot of plant materials. It goes through our system. If we're unfortunate enough to be killed at some point, those plant materials are still going to be in our system. So you can identify plant materials from the fragments in the alimentary canal, in the stomach, in the feces, and so forth. And that can give an indication of certainly recent meals, an indication of the post-mortem interval, how long it's been since the person died, and can link victim to killers in some cases. Can help with the identification of toxic plants or drug abuse. So the case on the slide here is where a young woman was raped, and they found plant fragments on her clothing from her feces. When people are killed, they often void themselves. And so feces are part of her being killed. She voided herself. Her feces had got onto her clothing and also got onto the suspect's clothing. And when they looked at the plant fragments in the feces, they found the same plants. So the feces on his clothing was the same as on her clothing and in her actual feces. And here's just one of them. This is a pepper seed. And there were some others that all matched up as well. So careful look, matched up the suspect to the victim, looking at intestinal contents. All right, getting smaller now. Seeds, spores, pollen, and diatoms. Things, that seeds we can see. Spores produced by ferns and mosses. Pollen, diatoms, which is single-celled algae. Very tiny things. You would have no idea that you're carrying these things around. And we probably all are right now. We probably all have some pollen I don't know about diatoms unless you've been wading in a stream or a lake, but spores, if you've been walking around the garden, buying some plants that are in flower, you may have some pollen on you. So on the top there's some pollen, and just about every species of plant has a different sort of pollen grain, and you can tell them apart. An expert can tell them apart. Diatoms are these single-celled algae that have basically a glass case around them. That is, and both that glass case on diatoms and the wall of pollen is very resistant to decay. So when everything else decomposes, these things will still be there. So you can find them in soil, in lakes, and so forth, and on clothing. Now, an interesting thing about diatoms, and this is a picture here, is that if a body is found in a body of water, like a lake or a stream, one thing you want to know is whether it drowned there or was already dead and dumped. And diatoms can tell you. Because if a body is already dead and it's dumped in the water, that water will get in through the nose and through the mouth and get into the lungs. And you can look at the diatoms, and if they're the same, they're probably going to be the same as the diatoms in the lake. But if a body is drowned in that body of water, in those last moments when the body is trying to breathe some air in, and they're breathing in water instead, there's enough pressure that some of that lake stream water will get through the alveoli in the bronchi in the lungs into the bloodstream. And at that point, the blood is still moving around for the last few seconds. And so everything that gets through will get transported around the body, and diatoms will then stick around or get deposited in the bone marrow or the femur or in the liver, where a lot of blood is going through these things. So if you've got a drowned body and you find diatoms in the femur or the liver, probably drowned right there. So they can be incredibly, incredibly useful. So here's a case. This is my only dead body picture, by the way. So if you look away and look back later if you want. So this is a case from a long time ago. A woman was pulled out of the Hudson River in New York. And there she is. So why is she there? How did she die? Who killed her? So what they saw was there were neck wounds indicating strangulation. She had drugs in her system. It's an antihistamine. So she'd been given or taken too much of an antihistamine that will cause someone to be very, very sleepy and pass out. Her femoral bone marrow had diatoms, indicating that she'd actually drowned where they found the body. And those diatoms were the same species of diatoms as in the river, in the river. And also the same diatoms were found on her shoes, watch, and a wallet that were found in the vicinity. So the first suspect they had was her boyfriend. He said, no, not me, nothing to do with me. I don't know what's going on. But apparently a nephew was an accomplice and fessed up, testified against him and said what happened was, for whatever reason, the boyfriend wanted to get rid of the girlfriend. And so he drugged her and dumped her body in the river. But she came to. So he jumped in and strangled her as she drowned in the river. Horrific, horrific. But you can see how the diatoms were a key part of this case, establishing how she died, that she died where they found the body. All right, DNA. You've probably all heard many times about the use of human DNA in cases, matching people up and so forth. Well, the first use of plant DNA was a little bit later. It was back in 1992 in Maricopa County in Arizona, which is where Phoenix is. And a prostitute's body was found in brush at an abandoned factory. They found a pager. And this dates all of us, right? If you know what a pager is. Remember them? So they found a pager, and that gave them a suspect, a fellow called Mark Bogan. And so they wanted more, and they found in the bed of his truck seed pods of a Palo Verde tree. That's the tree on the picture there. It's a very common tree in the deserts out there. So how useful is that? Well, the body was found underneath a Palo Verde tree, and the tree had some damage on it, like the truck had knocked against it, perhaps trying to get away or something. But still, that's not enough. There are lots of Palo Verde trees. And he could simply say, well, I got seed pods from a Palo Verde tree in my truck. Big deal, right? They're everywhere. So they brought in a geneticist, and they did a DNA analysis of the seed pods and the tree under which the body was found, and some other trees round about. And the only match was between the seed pods and the tree under which the body was found. That's an exact paternity test, basically, on plants. So they got a murder conviction. And that established the admissibility of plant DNA evidence into courts. So since that time, this sort of evidence has been used. And here's a case that was involved one of the botanical garden scientists. So in 2019, a woman called Menji Ji disappeared. Of course, her husband, you can see him on the right there, I don't know, she disappeared, just gone, 2 years later, they found her body buried in a juniper grove in Columbia, Missouri, just, not too far from here. So her husband was Joseph Eldridge, and they looked at his hiking boots. Now, why he didn't clean them, I don't know. I heard before the talk, I heard someone saying, who's going to tell us how to kill my husband? No, I can tell you what you shouldn't do or how you'll get caught. So he didn't clean his boots, and they found juniper needles and other plant fragments on the mud on his hiking boots. And then one of the conservation geneticists working here at the garden, Dr. Christine Edwards, looked into this, or they invited us to look into this. And she did a DNA test and found that the DNA on the juniper needles on his boots matched the junipers in the grove where the body was found. That tied him into the crime scene. Lesson, wash your boots. He was convicted. So juniper trees are very, very common. So they had to have an exact match to the junipers where the body was found, which is what they did get. And junipers have these interesting botanical nerdy stuff here first, because this is a botany audience, right? Junipers have these two sorts of leaves. So most of the leaves are these scale leaves that you see on the bottom there, but the newest leaves on the trees are these little needle-type leaves. The two sorts of leaves on junipers. And these are what they apparently found in the mud on his hiking shoes. All right, a couple of other ways in which botanical evidence can be important. Poisons. Anybody recognize this person here? That's Socrates. And he was famously condemned to death and asked to choose how he would be killed. And he chose plant poison. And he chose poison hemlock on the top there, which contains conine. And a lot of times these chemicals in plants are named after the plant. So Conium maculatum, poison hemlock, the chemical is called conine. A lot of plants have poisons in them. Here are some of the common plants that you know about that have poisons in them. Daffodils, foxgloves, jimsonweeds, oleander, yew trees, and the list goes on. Don't eat any of these. So a couple of examples of plant poisons and how they've been used. Strychnine, from the plant Strychnus nux vomica, contains an alkaloid, which is a nitrogen-containing compound. Very poisonous. If you get strychnine in you, you will not recover if you get above the lethal dose. It has been used as a rodenticide and somehow gets into street heroin. What it causes is these spasms, opisthotonous spasms. You can see a picture on the bottom. It's not a picture, it's a painting. And it causes, excuse me, the major muscles in the body to contract. And the biggest muscles in the back of your legs and your forearms and your cheeks compared with others around about. So the body arches back, arms fold in, and you get the grin, which is thought to be the inspiration for the Joker. Maybe. It's an incredibly painful death. And there's been a lot of cases where people have had this plant poison. Listen there, Alexander the Great, maybe. You know, be sure about these things back to the past. Jane Stanford, the husband of the man that founded Stanford University. Robert John, a blues legend, the president of Turkey, the wife of an NFL player, a Russian critic. And it's still going on, 94 cases in France since 2008, strychnine. But don't use it to kill your husband because the symptoms are so obvious. Ricin. Maybe this is a better choice. I don't know. I'm not giving out advice. But castor oil plant, very, very poisonous. This is one of the things when they say they're looking at powders that have been sent to politicians, they're looking for either anthrax or ricin. So this inhibits protein synthesis and kills you. And a very famous case of this was the umbrella assassination back in 1978, where a Russian dissident was killed after he was injected with a pellet, an aluminium pellet with wax on it that had ricin inside. And the injection was through an umbrella that was stuck into the back of his leg as he was getting onto a London bus in London. So apparently he's getting on the bus and some other fellow said, "Oh, I'm sorry." but he succumbed and died. And that's what killed him. But the umbrella, a very sophisticated device that they developed. And, you know, everyone in London carries an umbrella, so nothing suspicious about that. Except it's normally raining, so it needs to be anyway. But that's a nasty poison. All right. Last topic in the book is poaching. This is the thing that there are a lot of plants that are highly protected because they're rare. And there's a convention, an international convention called the CITES Convention or the Washington Convention that countries have signed up to that regulates transport of these plants. And there's different categories, and the first one is Appendix 1, and there are a number of orchids in that category, and they're absolutely not allowed to be transported from one country to another unless they've been artificially propagated. All the rest of the orchids are in Appendix 2, which you need official permits. And this is where the problem comes in, because people will bribe officials for the permits. Or they'll do what they did in the bottom here, which is to mix in some rare plants with common plants that they've got a permit for. And orchids, when they're not in flower, are just a few strap-like leaves. Very difficult to tell apart, extremely difficult without a DNA test or something. And this is a case where they did find some. The top is ghost orchid, and this was being taken out of swamps in Florida illegally. Beautiful plant. People like to collect orchids. And some people take that passion to the extreme where they're willing to pay for illegal plants, that are rare plants. So here's an example of tropical trees that are protected, rare trees, and but they are harvested for furniture. And a lot of this are ramin or rosewood, which are illegally imported through China, mostly from Indonesia. Showing the map shows the route there, or from Madagascar. And they're turned into furniture, window blinds and dowels and so forth. And this is a huge industry. Once they cut these trees down and they start the transport, it's very difficult to identify them because you just got some planks of wood. And there's lots of different species. And so it's hard. You need experts to figure out what you've got to see whether someone is actually transporting what they have a permit for. And again, government officials are open to bribes and all this sort of thing. So recently there was a blog post in which one of the Missouri Botanical Garden botanists was quoted. He's saying, about these trees, they're not emblematic big mammals that we can all feel sorry for and hug and love, the charismatic megafauna idea. This massive part of the legal trade is simply not on anybody's radar screen. There are people that know about it, but it's not on enough people's radar screen, so it happens. So if you'd like to buy a rosewood bed frame, you can go online, and there's a store in Chicago that will sell you this. This is on there right now. How much do you think this is worth if you want to buy it? Any ideas? Sorry?
40,000.
Oh, you willing to pay? It's 6,000, actually. That seems a lot to me for a bed frame. But now, how they got this? They say it's rosewood. How they can do this, I don't know, but it's on their website. I haven't been up to check, but it's a problem because they're taking these things out of rainforests. All right, I'm going to finish with the chapter that didn't get in my book. So if you bought my book, I hope you enjoy everything, but you won't have this chapter. Publishers are like this, This chapter doesn't fit with the theme of the book. I think it does. Anyway, forensic botany, this is kind of what drew me to this subject in the first place to a large extent. Forensic botany in fiction, kind of the whodunit mysteries, the cozy murders, tracking murderers, identifying poisons. And a lot of authors talk about forensic botany in their novels. Shakespeare, Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes, and some more recent ones that are shown here. So if you like to read this sort of stuff, think about the forensic evidence. Agatha Christie, 28 of her mystery novels involved poisons. And here are some of them listed here, some of the different plants that murderers used in her books, from yew trees, foxgloves, hemlock, and so forth. And she used poisons, not just plant poisons, but arsenic and other things as well. So many times, there's even a book called A is for Arsenic, The Poisons of Agatha Christie. It's a fascinating book. You can go through each of these different poisons and see how it, kind of spoiler alerts, how it gets into the different novels. So one of them is, to give you an idea, is her book called A Pocketful of Rye. And in this story, it involves taxine, which is a toxic alkaloid found in yew trees, Taxus genus. And all parts of yew trees are poisonous apart from the red aril around the outside of the seeds. I've never wanted to test that, but that's what they say. But anyway, it causes rapid death. There's no antidote. And Agatha Christie uses it in this particular story where taxine, or the yew extract, was put into marmalade and fed to the victim at Yew Tree Cottage. And so that early on, and the story is all about who did it. So the botanical mystery is not great, but how did this happen and what happened with what she goes on about in this case. A Miss Marple story. If you want to know more about these things, that chapter that got thrown out of my book, you can download it from that link there. And if you don't have time to take a picture of it, you can pick up one of these bookmarks at the end. They're outside, and it's got that code there. And so you can download it for free, or you can go to Amazon and get it for 99 cents. You can't give things away on Amazon, but it's available. And it's called Juice of the Cursed Lebanon. So you have to read it to figure out why I called it that. All right, so thank you very much. I enjoyed giving my talk.